Last year, I received an invitation to a Halloween party at an old house in the neighboring district. The invitation was curious, handmade with twisted lettering, and said the party would start at 11 p.m., quite late for a celebration. The house in question had been closed for years, but apparently, someone had rented it for the occasion. Although it seemed odd, my curiosity got the better of me. I've always liked exploring the darker side of Halloween. The night was cold, and a thick fog enveloped the streets as I walked toward the address. The few lights from nearby houses seemed distant, swallowed by the darkness. When I reached the house, I saw it was decorated with candles in the windows and eerie figures hanging on the porch. The door was ajar, and soft, melancholic music drifted out into the night, almost inviting me to step inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door shut behind me with a sharp, unsettling noise. The interior was a mix of luxurious decay and abandonment. Old furniture covered in sheets, dusty chandeliers, and tattered curtains swaying in the draft. But what really caught my attention was the main hall. It was filled with people in elaborate costumes, but something was off. Their clothes seemed to belong to different eras. There were suits from the 1920s, Victorian dresses, and porcelain masks hiding their faces. I tried talking to some people, but they ignored me, moving slowly around the room as if in a trance, part of some strange, dark ritual. Thinking it might be part of the party's atmosphere, I decided to explore further. In the hallway, I came across a large antique mirror, and when I looked at it, I noticed something disturbing. The figures reflected in the mirror were staring directly at me, even though in the room they had their backs turned. Their empty eyes and pale faces, hidden behind masks, were fixed on my reflection, as if I was the only one visible. I hurried back to the main hall, but the guests seemed even closer to me, as if they had moved while I wasn't looking. The music had shifted to something darker, a haunting melody that echoed through the walls. A chill ran down my spine, and I began to sense that something was terribly wrong. I tried to leave, but when I reached the door, it was locked. The key, which had been in the lock earlier, was gone. At that moment, a tall, ominous figure wearing a mask that covered half of his face approached me. Without a word, he handed me a letter, written in the same twisted handwriting as the invitation. When I opened it, the paper bore a single phrase: "The party is for you." I looked around, and all the guests were now staring directly at me. No longer dancing or wandering the hall, they stood still, silent, watching, as if waiting for something. Panic set in. I started banging on the windows, trying to get out, but the glass seemed unbreakable, and no one outside could hear me. The guests began to murmur in unison, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. They moved closer, forming a circle around me, their whispers growing louder. One by one, the candles in the hall went out, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the masked figure, smiling cruelly as he held a candle near my face. I woke up the next morning on the lawn in front of the house. The mansion was completely closed up, the windows locked, and all the Halloween decorations had disappeared. I ran to the police to report what had happened, but they told me the house had been vacant for over 50 years. Ever since a Halloween party there had ended in tragedy, with all the guests mysteriously disappearing. Since that night, I've avoided any unexpected Halloween invitations. But every year, as the date approaches, I find a new letter on my doorstep, always with the same message: "You are the guest of honor." The party resumes. In my town, there was a legend about a house that only appeared on Halloween night. No one knew exactly where it was located, but many said that if you drove along the rural roads outside the town, you could spot it in the distance, surrounded by mist and with pale lights glowing in the windows. My curiosity had always been piqued, so last Halloween, I decided to search for this elusive house. I took my car down a secluded road, where the trees formed tunnels of shadows, and the only light came from my headlights. A light drizzle made the road slippery, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. After about half an hour of aimless driving, I saw something between the trees. A house I had never seen before. It was a Victorian mansion, with a facade worn down by time and dirty windows that reflected the moonlight. I decided to get closer. The house seemed abandoned for years, but a faint light flickered in one of the upstairs windows, like a candle on the verge of going out. As I approached the front door, it creaked open with a sinister sound, revealing a long, dark hallway. I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me, and the echo of it reverberated throughout the house. The walls were covered with old portraits, all of people with stiff, emotionless expressions. But as I walked down the hall, the faces in the paintings seemed to change, their mouths curling into strange, unsettling smiles, as if they were watching me. I climbed the stairs, which creaked under my feet, until I reached the room where the light was coming from. When I opened the door, I found an empty room, except for a single armchair facing a broken window. A hooded figure sat in the chair, its back to me. I asked if everything was all right, but there was no response. The figure remained motionless, only lifting a bony finger to point at a large mirror in the corner of the room. When I approached the mirror, what I saw made me shiver. The reflection showed the room behind me full of people, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. But there was no one actually there. In the reflection, I saw the hooded figure slowly lift its head, revealing a skeletal face, with a grotesque smile that couldn't belong to anything human. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder, and I turned around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was now standing beside me, its smile stretching as far as the thin, pale skin would allow. I bolted from the room, running down the stairs in a panic, but the steps seemed to multiply beneath my feet, as if the house was trying to trap me. When I finally reached the front door and threw it open, the mist outside was so thick I could barely see the path back to my car. I ran to the vehicle and sped off down the road, trying to ignore the whispers coming from the back seat. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the house fading into the mist, as if it had never existed. But what haunts me to this day is that ever since that night, every time I pass by a mirror, I see the hooded figure standing in the background, just watching, waiting for something I still don't understand. I grew up in a small town surrounded by forests and lakes. On Halloween, it was a tradition for the local kids to gather by an old lake, known for being a place where, many years ago, several people had mysteriously vanished without a trace. Last year, one of my friends suggested we do something different. We would carve pumpkin lanterns and let them float on the lake at midnight. The challenge was to see who had the courage to wait until the lights went out on their own. Halloween night arrived under a starless sky, and the fog seemed to swallow the forest around us. We walked to the lake, lanterns in hand, our footsteps muffled by the damp leaves beneath us. When we reached the water's edge, we placed the floating lanterns on the surface. The orange lights reflected off the dark water, creating a sinister glow that rippled with the small waves. First, it was fun. We laughed and told scary stories, waiting for the candles to burn out. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere became strangely tense. The wind suddenly stopped, and the lake became eerily still. The lanterns stopped drifting, all aligning in a straight line as if someone was controlling them. One of my friends tried to light a cigarette, but his lighter kept failing. That's when we all heard it, a muffled sound of whispers coming from the middle of the lake. We couldn't understand the words, but there was a tone of desperation. The whispers grew louder, and the lanterns began to slowly drift away, as if something unseen was pulling them towards the center of the lake. One of us suggested we should retrieve the lanterns, thinking maybe there was some sort of current at play. I grabbed a branch and reached out towards one of the nearby floating lanterns. The moment I touched the water, an intense cold surged up my arm, like I had plunged it into ice. And then I saw it, a hand emerging from the water, gripping my wrist tightly. It was a pale, bloated hand with long fingers that coiled around my arm. I pulled with all my strength while my friends screamed, but it felt as though something in the lake was determined to drag me under. Finally, I broke free and fell back, tumbling into the cold mud. When I looked back, the hand was gone, but the lanterns were now all extinguished, and the lake's murmuring had turned into a deathly silence. We bolted through the forest, running back to town, but when we reached the town's edge, something was waiting for us. All the lanterns we had left floating on the lake were there, lit, lined up along the road as if someone or something had brought them back ahead of us. There were muddy footprints on the asphalt, leading straight to the lake. Since that night, none of us have dared to go back to the lake. But every Halloween night, as midnight approaches, I see the orange lights glowing on the horizon, as if something or someone is still waiting for us in the water. And the whispers, they haunt my nightmares, always calling me back.